Thank you for doing this. I know today was a busy day at the office.
Yeah.
I guess every day is a busy day at the office when you're running two big companies.
Some are more intense than others. This is on the more intense side.
Let's talk about Tesla. And if one were to believe everything one reads in the press, which I don't as a former journalist, the recent fires in the Tesla cars sound like the Hindenburg disaster in 1937.
Right, the humanity.
Reality is somewhat different. Tell us what really happened there.
So I think, first of all, that it's fair for a new technology to receive more scrutiny than older technologies, because it should be held to a higher standard. But there's some reasonable limit to what that increased standard should be. And I mean, since the Model S went into production about 1.5 years ago, there have been about 250,000 gasoline car fires in the US, about 400 deaths, 1,200 serious injuries. Our 3 fires, which caused no injury, received more headline news than the other 250,000 combined. That seems like an unreasonable ratio, I think.
And I believe all 3 owners of those cars who crashed wanted to get another one.
Yes. Right, exactly. It's like, don't take my word for it. Like that was, like I said, well, how soon can they get a loaner car until the insurance thing gets figured out? And so obviously we gave them one right away. But I mean, that's the acid test. Like, does the guy that experienced the fire, does he want to have that same car again?
You feel safe in it.
Yeah.
Stock price down again today, 10%. Do you care about that?
I mean, it kind of sucks running a public company.
Yeah.
I mean, the stock goes through these huge gyrations, for like seemingly arbitrary reasons. And then I'm asked to explain why it changed. I'm like, I have no idea.
It should be pointed out it's up 300% on the year.
Yeah, right. I mean, on balance, that's still good. But I mean, when the stock price was way higher and people asked me what I think of the valuation, I said, well, I think it's probably more than we have a right to deserve. We'll try to get there in the long term, and I think we will, and probably exceed it. But I would not try to justify that a company with a little over $2 billion of revenue should be worth $22 billion in market cap. That does seem pretty high to me. It's like, yeah.
And it's fair to say you wouldn't be there without government subsidy.
Well, I think it would have taken longer. So there's a slight misperception about the history of Tesla, which is that the government funding was pivotal. It was an accelerant, but it was not pivotal. The really pivotal point was an investment from Daimler in 2009, early 2009, when there was, I basically spent all the money I had, and we had one company that was willing to invest, or one entity that was willing to invest, period, and that was Daimler. And if they hadn't come in with that investment, we would definitely be dead. Fortunately,
dead, bankrupt, finished.
Yeah, gone. Fortunately, they did, and we've done a number of vehicle programs with Daimler. There's the Mercedes B-Class, which is not currently produced in the US, but it's very popular in Europe and other parts of the world. Will be coming to the US, and that'll have a Tesla battery pack and powertrain. It'll be the largest electric vehicle program in Daimler history. So got a great relationship. They've been a great supporter.
How about self-drive version of Tesla?
I do think that's an important technology, although the difficulty increases exponentially to get to fully self-driving, to cover all the corner cases. So I think we can get to maybe 90% of miles driven being autopilot, as we call it, because we're using the sort of aircraft analogy. I think we'll get there pretty soon, maybe in a few years. But then covering that last 10% is really difficult. And so getting from 90% to 99, then to 99.9, and then ultimately to be truly self-driving, like you can fall asleep in the car arrives at your destination, which would be really great.
Some people do already, by the way.
Yeah, exactly.
They die.
Yeah. That's good. I think you probably need like 6 nines of reliability. Like the standard would be actually way higher than the safety of a person, or probably by a factor of 10 or 100. In order for people to be comfortable, or otherwise, well, like this fire thing. Just like a car is basically the safest car you could possibly drive if you care about fires, and that's not the impression one would have reading the headlines. You would have sort of the opposite impression. And so for self-driving or autopilot, hopefully the media doesn't do the same thing, same like mega disproportionate response. But I do think that it should be held to a standard that's maybe like 10 times better than a person.
And I know Google's working on this too. 10 years, more or less?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the right path is probably a little different from what Google is pursuing. Larry Page is an old friend of mine. I've known him since before he got venture funding for Google. And I think he's a really brilliant guy. But I mean, it's not. Google isn't focusing on autonomous cars, whereas it's going to be a pretty significant focus for Tesla. And from our standpoint, it only matters if the autopilot capability does not result in a substantial cost increase to the car. And the way the Google sensor suite is set up, it's like they were like 60 grand. I mean, that's like a lot.
I want to ask you about risk-taking. Because there's a theory that entrepreneurs who hit it out of the park one time make that $1 billion+ company work.
Right.
They are reluctant to do it again, not because they're afraid of losing their money, but because they feel if they were to fail a second time round, then in their own minds maybe they would think, well, the first time it was just luck. It wasn't really my own skill or my own sense of how to run a business. But not only did you rose, PayPal came up to 1.5 billion, you got out of that. Not only did you invest again, but you invested again twice. Not only that, but you chose probably 2 of the most risky capital-intensive industries to go with. Rocket technology, which is basically a bomb,
right.
directed up,
yeah.
And then cars, which are, we know what's happening in Detroit.
Yeah.
So what is it that motivates there to do that, to go through the crucible again, 2 times again?
Yeah, I'm not sure it was the right decision, but...
so far, so good.
Yeah. It's much less fun than it may appear, but I mean, the case of what I thought I would do was start and run SpaceX, and then create an electric car company with a few other people. But just like apply 20% of my time and work on the product design. Because my main thing is engineering and design. So that was an illusion. And then I don't really have any choice but to apply a ton of time to Tesla, or the company would be definitely dead. So.
But the other way to do it, you could have stayed in Silicon Valley, started another few internet companies, made $1 billion, and then you could have bought Chrysler and probably bought NASA too, and you wouldn't have to start from scratch. That seems too easy.
Yeah.
All right, we'll move on.
I don't really want to. The point is not to sort of own a car company, but rather to accelerate the advent of sustainable transport. And it seemed like it would be difficult.
Let's talk about SpaceX. SpaceX, you have said you started with the specific intention of getting to Mars.
Well, the origin of SpaceX was actually not. My interest in space, my initial thought in space was that it wasn't possible to create a company, and I mistakenly thought that the reason that we'd not sent people to Mars was because we'd lost the will to explore or something, or like maybe that, and I thought, well, maybe that needs to be reignited. And so I came up with this idea to do basically a philanthropic mission to Mars with a 100% probability of losing all the money in order to reignite interest in that goal. But after a while, I realized that was a mistake. I mean, particularly the United States is a nation of explorers. Came here from other parts of the world. I think more than any other country is a distillation of the human spirit of exploration. There's no lack of will. But people need to believe that there's a way, that in a way that's feasible and that it's not going to bankrupt the country and their living standard won't be materially affected. And then I think they're super keen on that goal.
Now, as you look out, whatever we're talking, 10, 15, 20 years to get to Mars, it's not just rocket technology, and you've talked about reusable rocket technology, it's also how you shield people from radiation. It's a 10, 12-month trip. What you do when they arrive. How are they going to live there? Is that something that you want to work on too, or will you partner with other companies? How do you see that playing out over the next decade? Well,
I actually think the technology required to live on Mars is not particularly difficult. But getting there is really difficult. I mean, it's like hundreds of millions of miles.
To get to Death Valley.
Yeah, exactly. To get to a place that kind of looks like Arizona, Or like a cold version of Arizona with not quite as much water. I mean, at least that's my guess is I think if we can get there, the technology required to live there is not a really big challenge. I mean, Mars has some advantages. It's quite sort of Earth-like in some ways. It's got a rotational period of 24.5 hours, by far the closest of any other planet. The atmosphere is carbon dioxide. No, it's at a low pressure, but if you were to have a transparent dome, all you'd need is a pump and some fertilizer, and you could grow plants on Mars. The plants would convert the CO2 to oxygen.
The other thing that's been big in the news recently is the Hyperloop, which you have sketched out, you estimate, from LA to San Francisco in 35 minutes.
Yeah, now, you could push that a little bit, but...
Well, I'd be happy if I could get from Santa Monica to downtown LA in 35 minutes.
I know.
I know you have your personal issues with the 405.
The 405 is like the most brutal construction project I've ever personally witnessed. I mean, it's like mind-boggling.
But I also know that, so you sketched this out, but I know that your plans for the Hyperloop have been put into some pretty sophisticated simulation technology.
Yeah.
And it looks like it actually might work. Am I right?
Yeah. And we did run simulations at SpaceX and Tesla. So, we thought it would work, but I mean, I actually don't think it's particularly like. I mean, I think it's like the engineering of it that it would work is actually pretty obvious, honestly. But I mean, so I think the larger issues are political, getting the political support to do something like that, and then making sure the economics pan out. Yeah, I hope someone does it, because I think it would be cool. I mean, it would be great to have something like that. It's just like, it doesn't seem like our mass transportation is getting better. It seems to be kind of getting worse. So that's not a good future.
You said something there, you hope somebody else would do it. I'm curious, what makes you really so unique is not only your ability to dream big, but to execute. There are lots of utopian thinkers out there, but they cannot execute. Yeah. But there are some other people who can do good things. And I'm wondering what seems to motivate you. You see things that frustrate you or you think are not as good as you like, and then you try and fix them. You've worked on solar power, you've worked on electric cars, and on interplanetary space travel. I'm wondering what other things about America, and about the world for that matter, would you like to see fixed either by a company you might do yourself or by someone, a smart entrepreneur? What else out there is feasible? You know, we all want to get rid of world poverty and get rid of childhood diseases, but what problems out there can feasibly be fixed, say, in our lifetimes?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, the world's actually pretty great right now. I mean, arguably better than any point in history. And this is sometimes lost. If you read the newspapers, they're like a magnification of all the world's problems. It's like, I mean, newspapers seem to be attempting to answer the question, what was the worst thing that happened on Earth today? Yeah, and it's...
You're right. If it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah, and it's like, okay. I mean, and I think there is kind of an evolutionary reason for that, because it makes more sense to, like, you want to prioritize danger over reward, or risk, because you know, if you get eaten by the lion, it's game over. But you know, if you forget where you left some snack, that's okay. I mean, you know, so there's it's not quite the same in terms of the risk-reward balance, but we didn't evolve with newspapers and global media. So, like, our brain's sort of having a fear response to a bunch of dangers that are extremely unlikely to ever affect us. But yeah, just yeah.
You have, I believe, about 3,000 people at Tesla.
We have 6,000, yeah. 6,000.
I'm malinformed, and SpaceX is
3,500.
So that's a massive agglomeration of engineering talent. Huge.
Yeah.
If I could take the metaphor of a ship, how much time do you have to go down into the engine room, roll up your sleeves, get your hands dirty, and fix stuff as an engineer? And how much time do you spend on the bridge steering and looking at the distant horizon?
Well, not a lot on that last point. There's a constant flurry of executional challenges, and so I try to triage my time according to what would be best for the companies, and still, you know, have some time to see my kids, you know, because I don't want to miss them growing up. So, it can vary from big issues to things that seem small but actually could have a really big impact. So, I mean, it's all the way from design aesthetics to the details of, say, the vehicle functionality, or in the case of the rocket, the avionics, propulsion system, and airframe. I mean, the rocket is kind of has more of a concentrated pucker factor, because you've got these launches, and at least with a car you can do a recall or like do a software update. That's not going to happen with the rocket. So it's like passing grade is 100%, which induces anxiety, you know.
How do you handle launch anxiety when you're actually waiting the countdown? We saw one here.
Well, these ones, actually, I mean, I have quite a lot of anxiety, because I always think, oh, there must be something that we did wrong, and you know, is there anything I could have done to prevent this hypothetical thing bad thing from occurring? I mean, the last roughly 10 launches have worked, but the 3 launches we started off with did not. So by far the worst emotional stress was the 4th launch of Falcon 1, because the first 3 launches did not make it to orbit. They got to sort of space on launches 2 and 3, but they didn't get to full orbital velocity. And when I started out, I figured I would have enough money for three launches.
Oops.
Yeah.
Oops.
So we squeaked by on the fourth one.
We sent out a link today. I don't know how many of you saw it, but it's of you using your hands as 3D molding sort of tools for stuff you're doing on a computer screen, and it's a rocket engine that you're able to manipulate with your hands. And I know that you have told Jon Favreau, who produced or directed Iron Man, that that was the inspiration, because we see Tony Stark doing this in the movie.
Absolutely.
And I know also, I've read a bit, Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, you've also said has been inspiration. So I'm wondering,
I'm a big fan of Asimov, actually.
when you're on the cutting edge of technology today, in the fields that you're in, do you feel you've almost got one foot in science fiction? Is that, do you have to be that far ahead?
Well, you have to imagine an outcome in order to head in that direction. And science fiction explores a lot of different ideas, so it can be helpful as a source of inspiration. And like books, TV shows, movies, I mean, they're all, I think, sources of inspiration. I mean, most of the movies and TV shows about space are totally wrong, but they still have interesting ideas. Like the Star Trek communicator was an inspiration for the cell phone.
Yeah, with the flip, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
In
fact, the weird thing is, like the phones we have in our pocket vastly exceed what was on Star Trek.
We're going to go to ask some of our students some questions, but first, one more. I'm a big James Bond fan. You just bought the Lotus Esprit that they used in The Spy Who Loved Me, which goes underwater.
Yeah.
And you're going to make that work.
It's definitely a backburner project.
Okay, but my question is, when do we get to see a functioning version of the Millennium Falcon?
That's a tricky one, because it's not actually the right shape.
Uh-oh. Note to George Lucas.
Yeah. I mean, the Falcon 9, our Falcon rocket was named after the Millennium Falcon, even though it looks nothing like it. That's not the shape you'd want for a spaceship, really.
Okay, so if we can swing the camera to our student tables, and we get a couple of questions from there, and then I'll go to the written questions from the rest of the audience.
So here we go.
Good evening, sir. My name's Ariel Jaimes. I'm from Vaughan Next Century. Referring to Merlin 9, does SpaceX have a working prototype, and when will it be ready to launch?
Merlin is the name of our engine. And the Falcon 9 is the name of the rocket. And we've done several launches of Falcon 9, and an important milestone happened a few months ago, which was the launch of the next generation Falcon 9, which is designed to be able to return and land at the launch pad. We came close on the initial mission, but didn't quite get there. We need to make a few corrections, but I think we've got a good chance of getting there next year.
Okay, let's go for another one there.
Hi, I'm Kennedy Green from Harvard Westlake. So I've seen you speak at a TED Talk, and I remember you spoke pretty emphatically about the success of your innovations and how you kind of take a physics approach, where you take the idea and boil it down to its basics, and from there start to build up. So can you talk about an example where you use that process?
Well, I think, an important thing in innovation or trying to create new things is to try really hard to do that, which may sound incredibly obvious, but that's what I find is most often what people don't do. They actually didn't try super hard to come up with something new. And it is helpful to have cross-pollination of industries. I mean, it's been quite difficult to run SpaceX and Tesla, but there has been good ideas. Since I got both in my mind space, there's good ideas going back and forth. For example, on the car, with respect to the car, the Model S is the only all-aluminum body and chassis car made in North America, and very few cars are all aluminum. In the aerospace industry, that's the default. So it seemed like obviously the right move in order to minimize the non-battery pack mass of the car. So in order to offset a fairly heavy battery pack, we had to make the rest of the car light, but still achieve a 5-star safety rating. I don't think it would have been possible to do that if we had used steel, which is the traditional method. And what's helped SpaceX has been that the car industry is really good at making complicated objects at a low cost. I mean, it's actually quite incredible that one can buy a decent car for $20,000. I mean, all the stuff that's in that car is, I mean, it's nutty how much stuff is in a car. At SpaceX, I hired a bunch of people from the auto industry to run manufacturing, which has worked out reasonably well.
Let's take 2 more student questions, please, and then we'll come to the other written ones.
Hello. I'm Natalie Watson from Marlborough School, and we have a sort of 2-part question that builds. So, why do you think Tesla succeeded whereas other companies, car companies, have failed in their methods of electric cars? And is the location in Silicon Valley an important part of this?
Yeah, I think being in Silicon Valley is pretty important because what's really critical with electric cars is electrical engineering, software, and electronics. And Silicon Valley has the best concentration of talent in those areas in the world. And yeah. So, sorry, what was the first part of the question?
Why did you succeed?
Oh, why do we succeed? Oh, yeah, all right.
I'm sorry, what was your question? Oh, the first
right.
part, okay. Why do you think Tesla succeeded whereas other car companies failed in their methods of electric cars? Like, why do you think Tesla is the leader in this idea?
Well, I mean, there haven't been that many car company startups. I mean, there was sort of Fisker and Coda, and then a few smaller ones, and then the rest has sort of been some fairly small-scale efforts by the big companies. I think if we say what was the difference between, say, Fisker and Tesla, that's maybe the most direct comparison. Tesla is a hardcore engineering company, and Fisker is kind of was based on styling. You know, it's like styling is good, important, but that's not the reason we don't have electric cars. So it's not, but for styling we would have electric cars. That's not the reason. So in the case of Fisker, they made a car that a lot of people think looked really good, but didn't work properly. So then people don't want to buy the car. That's like a pretty reasonable thing, I think. Yeah. I mean, if you think of what's the point of a company existing? The point is that it's a group of people that have gathered together to create a product. If the product is good, the company should exist, and if it is not good, the company should not exist. That seems like fundamental to the nature of companies. So clearly then one should focus on making the absolute best product you can, otherwise you reduce the probability of success. But a lot of companies focus on things that aren't really to do with the product, as though a company has any basis for existing apart from doing useful things. That's kind of strange.
Let's take one more student question, please.
Good evening, sir. My name is Eric Pelayo from Vaughan Next Century. And regarding the proposed Mars expedition, how exactly do you plan on making it cost efficient?
Sure. Well, no, that is indeed a tricky problem. Um, I mean, I feel reasonably possible that that success is at least one of the possible outcomes. It, like, this is I mean, this is pretty important when you're trying to do something. It's like, well, can that be one of the outcomes? I wasn't actually confident about that until a few years ago. Now, I'm not saying we will get there, but I'm confident that it is at least possible. And the key to that is having a fully reusable Mars transportation system so that all you are replacing between flights, maybe apart from minor maintenance, is the propellant. I mean, like, reusability is so fundamental to having a major change in space flight. It would be difficult to overstate its importance. But I mean, I think with analogy to other modes of transport, you can imagine that if airplanes could only be used once, very few people would fly, because it would be super crazy expensive. I guess like a 747 costs $250 million. You'd need 2 of them just for a round trip. But people are not paying $500 million to fly back and forth to London. And that's because you can use a 747 like 20,000 times. And for a rocket, a Falcon 9 rocket costs about $60 million to build. And so if it can be used once, obviously that's a $60 million capital cost. But if it can be used 1,000 times, then it's only a $60,000 capital cost. I mean, that is, it is the fundamental difference. So you have to have fully reusable, then you have to make sure that the propellant used is as low cost as possible. So our next generation rockets will be using methane as a fuel, which methane is the lowest cost source fuel on the planet, by a good margin. So, and so I think if your propellant costs are low and the system is fully reusable, then I think it should be possible to move to Mars for less than $500,000, which I think is an important threshold, because if people can sell all this stuff on Earth and move to Mars, well, and there's enough people who can do that, combined with those who actually want to do that, then that's the fundamental thing needed to have a growing colony on Mars. I mean, kind of like the way that the U.S. was, like the early English colonies in America. When it became affordable for people to sell all their stuff in England and move to America, it grew really fast. In the absence of that, it would just require humongous amounts of government support, and I think probably wouldn't result in a self-sustaining civilization. So the economics of it are extremely fundamental. No, thanks. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go to some questions that we got from the floor. And the first one I want to ask is, what do you think is the next battery technology after lithium-ion? I guess lithium-ion has sort of reached its ceiling, more or less, or no?
No, I think there are substantial improvements that will occur with lithium-ion batteries, without any no miracles required. The thing with lithium-ion technology in terms of the cost and energy density is that the sort of average improvement per year is about 8%, which isn't that noticeable on a one-year basis, but compound interest is a very powerful force. And so after, say, 4 or 5 years, the cost is cut in half, assuming there's a strong forcing function for improvement, which I think electric cars provide. So I feel pretty good about achieving a substantial reduction in the cost of the battery pack, say in kind of the 3 or 4 year time horizon.
Still way behind Moore's law for microchips.
Oh yeah, sure.
Double a year.
Nothing. I mean, the only thing that operates at Moore's law speed is Moore's law. semiconductors just had this incredible advantage that as you made them tinier, they got way more efficient. For something with that's a large, like a macro structure, like a battery pack, you just don't have, or really almost anything. Essentially, I say, in fact, anything except microprocessors and memory that does not improve at that pace.
Another question here, it's about medical technology. Is there a medical application or technology that you would like to change or see somebody else work on?
Well, medical technology, well, I think the thing that would sort of most profoundly affect people would be to be able to recode genetics, which is obviously a dodgy situation. But that's the thing. We're close to saturation on lifespan. I mean, it's sort of pretty much leveled out. And so even if you solve, say, any one particular disease, you maybe slightly improve life expectancy, but not a lot. It's just like you kind of have a genetic programming any given species for a certain lifespan. Like you cannot make a fruit fly live for 10 years, no matter what you do. I mean, no amount of healthy living, vitamins, or anything. It's like, so.
Ray Kurzweil's fruit flies live for 20 years.
that would be a truly astounding achievement. But yeah, so I mean, it's a really tricky subject. It's fraught with all sorts of moral issues, but that's the thing that would most affect people's lives. But it certainly is a double-edged sword. So.
Here's another question from a Tesla owner. Why is there no coat hook in the back?
Yeah.
He or she says, you can design a rocket, but you forgot the coat hooks?
Well, I didn't actually forget it. I intentionally didn't like it, so I didn't put it there. The aesthetics of it really bothered me, but and I know, obviously some people disagree with that decision, but I think we might have a retroactive fix for that if somebody has the panoramic roof, which is to basically have a hook on the bow section in the middle of the roof, and then your coat could hang down in the second row passenger footwell, which is actually slightly better than having a coat hook that's stuck on the side of the car. So I think we'll probably do that. Yeah.
Wherever that question came from, hold on.
It's not the first time I've heard that question.
I'm sure. Is there a future in hydrogen-fueled engines?
Yeah, actually, I'll mention one little anecdote, which is in the beginning of Model S production, I also didn't have reading lights in the second row because, I thought people were really going towards e-books, Kindle and iPad and that kind of thing. It's like, so they have their own light. They don't need like an actual light in the back. Then I was driving with one of my kids, and he was trying to read his book.
Daddy.
Yeah, I mean, he said, "This is the stupidest car in the world." Like, all right, we'll put the light back in.
Hydrogen-fueled engines, they have a future?
I don't think so. Hydrogen is a very difficult energy storage mechanism. I mean, essentially, it's a means of storing energy chemically. But there are way better. If you want to do that, there are way better materials than hydrogen. Like I'd go with methane or propane way before hydrogen. In fact, the way that they make the hydrogen is by taking methane and chopping the carbon atom off. So, well, that seems like a waste. Or they'll do electrolysis, which is even worse. So it's a really energy-intensive. It's either like you're either still mining hydrocarbons on a large scale, or you're applying massive amounts of electricity to separate H2O. And then sometimes they'll say, oh, well, hydrogen is the most common element in the universe. Yes, but not on Earth, which is an important consideration. You know, yeah. It's one of those things that sort of always sounds like, it's one of those things like, it's the future and it always will be. Like.
And then there's the Hindenburg issue.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the Hindenburg, my understanding is that the main issue was the paint on the outer surface as opposed to the hydrogen itself. But hydrogen does combust extremely well. Hydrogen has there's a good argument for hydrogen as a fuel in the upper stage of a rocket. Say Saturn V in the second and third stages had hydrogen. And particularly for the upper stage of a rocket where you're not volumetrically constrained. Or rather, you're mass constrained rather than volumetrically constrained. Hydrogen is good if you care about mass and terrible if you care about volume. And it's also horrible from a handling standpoint, because it's a really tiny molecule and it goes all over the place.
You look at Apple after Steve Jobs and Microsoft after Bill Gates struggle to keep up the momentum. I wonder, have you thought about the future of your companies, Tesla and SpaceX? I know you've talked about giving away a lot of your money, but then I know you've had some other thoughts about that, and you've looked at Ford and wondered if you want to give. I mean, where are you at on that succession issue now?
Well, I don't know if, like, I'm not sure about the whole sort of family dynasty from a wealth standpoint thing. I mean, that seems to often work out worse than if the kid wasn't given a huge sum of money. I mean, unless they've actually demonstrated a high ability to be a good steward of capital, then it's not going to work out, I think, to give them a huge sum of money. Now that said, I mean, I'm wavering a little bit on that because if you look at the example of Ford and GM, like GM went bankrupt, Ford did not. Ford had the Ford family as a stabilizing influence. So there could be some merit to having a family stabilizing influence, but maybe not necessarily complete control.
We're going to end with two questions on the Hyperloop, which has clearly aroused a lot of emotion in Los Angeles. One is from UCLA Anderson. I know that Gene Block is here, who runs UCLA. But they want to know, how do you envision the Hyperloop as an open source project to be run in traditional enterprise fashion, which would make profits? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I mean, I think it's going to be quite difficult for someone to execute the Hyperloop, and the thing that will really matter is how good is that company at executing, as opposed to the basic sort of ideas of the system. So I don't think a company has to worry too much about creating value if they're really good at execution. I mean, I think probably the best example of open source is Linux, and there's lots of companies that are quite valuable, even though Linux is open source.
And the follow-up to that is from somebody else who wants to know, when will the Hyperloop potentially be ready, and can we get to Australia?
That would be, I would not recommend it for going to Australia, because Australia is really far. So, like where something like a Hyperloop would work best is for distances that are maybe about 500 miles, but probably not more than 1,000. And that's because if you compare it to, say, an alternative being supersonic air transport, in order to go really fast with a plane, you have to climb pretty high, because the atmosphere just looks like molasses when you're going fast. So for distances certainly under 500 miles, you spend all your time just ascending and descending, and you don't really get an opportunity to spend time at cruise. So something like a Hyperloop can compete really well in that arena, because you instantly, or almost instantly, enter a low-pressure environment. And so the tube contains a low pressure environment that's, like the cruising altitude of, well, it's like very high altitude atmosphere, basically. And so you don't have to spend any time ascending or descending. So there's no way it would be, well, extremely difficult for a plane to be faster than a Hyperloop for distances under 500 miles, because of that ascent-descent thing. However, once you get to long distances, then the cost of the tube starts to become a big factor. And so then I'd say it's probably the right move is to go to supersonic transport, because then you're spending a large percentage of your time at cruise. And you could probably get there faster with a supersonic aircraft.
Interesting. So no kangaroos in the Hyperloop. I know you have an insane schedule. I know that you have to go from here back to your office tonight.
Yeah, I apologize for not being at my best. It's been like working most of last night. So.
We are deeply grateful you came. You gave us some time. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being down.
Right. Thanks.
You're done. I'll get you up on my phone.